companies are, saying like growth at all cost is not the play anymore. We know that, right? But that doesn't mean that growth has stopped. RevOps is becoming more and more strategic. So yeah, it's definitely versus what it used to be. It's much different, but I think there's remnants of the same kind of like, core goal for RevOps.
All right, everybody. Welcome to this episode of the RevAmp podcast. I'm very, very happy and grateful to have Hassan here as our guest. Hassan and I had the opportunity to meet in person here in New York City a few months ago at an event where we kind of talked about, RevOps and the future of RevOps and what it kind of really means going forward. And there were some really interesting conversations that were sparked, and I was glad that I was able to get Hassan on the podcast today. So, but before we jump into our conversation, but why don't you introduce yourself a little bit, give us some background about how you got to where you're at today?
Of course, nice to see you again. And so I'm Hassan Ishad. I am founder at Rev Infinity, which is a revenue operations consulting firm. And yeah, I have been in revenue operations for, I would say, almost close to a decade now, which is as long as revenue operations is, as we know. But my natural progression was like I started basically doing sales operations, and I was doing sales operations at a Series A startup. So as most of the people who work in the startup space know, there aren't that many resources. So naturally, I was asked to do marketing operations. I was also asked to do CS ops. And then it was great to know that finally somebody coined it revenue operations. And from there onwards, the rest is history. I've been, my love for ops and efficiency has just kept on growing. And it's great to see how, finally revenue operations is in the limelight. Fast forward a decade, I've worked in various different industries, various different scales. I worked at Series A companies. I worked at post-IPO companies. I worked at VC companies, PE-backed companies. So yeah, it's been an amazing journey so far. So and happy to share more.
Yeah, that's having that kind of such a long context around ops, even kind of predating the very good branding that was done in which we named it RevOps. Though there has been a movement lately to introduce this whole GTM engineering, but maybe we won't jump into that battle. You probably have seen a lot of things shift and change, not just the kind of embrace of the concept of revenue operations being kind of cross-departmental, but especially in the last few years, with the introduction of AI and other technologies and kind of the democratization of tooling, as well as kind of the budget ups and downs. So, I think from your perspective, kind of what have the shifts kind of been like? Where are we shifting to now? Like, what are kind of the trends that you're seeing? Maybe we can start there and kind of take it from there.
No, absolutely. And I think it's been a fascinating journey to see it all from the start, how things were moving. And the way I like to kind of like compare it, like early days of like SaaS, when things were coming out, same thing happened with AI. They were believers of that, like some early adopters. And I believe we're in a stage where still yet to see its full potential, like as AI is like, especially for RevOps, right? But how RevOps has eventually evolved is like we used to be more operational efficiency focused, where things were broken, things were fixing. A lot of like reactive things were happening because originated from sales ops. So sales ops traditionally was not seen as a very strategic function. And as it kind of grew, people adopted RevOps as like a sales ops 2.0. So we saw that like the operational part was like very much ingrained, and then there came a phase where it started becoming more like growth enabler, where we had this high growth cycle, every growth at all costs. Everybody was like, okay, RevOps is going to help us put these pillars in place, help us scale, move towards it. And all of a sudden the market changed. So now we're like, okay, how can RevOps be a strategic function, helps us, cutting cost in some areas, be more efficient. So it's interesting to see how the phases have actually gone through. And my opinion on like how AI is starting to, you know, blend into this whole world of RevOps is it's going to start, and my prediction is going to start taking away a lot of these like low level, low effort, like kind of like um, data issues and admin work that we used to do, and we used to hire maybe outsourcing somewhere in a cheaper, you know, country to do that. AI is starting to take a lot of that, which naturally pushes revenue operations into a more strategic function, right? As you free up a lot of that time. So it's very fascinating to see the journey, and yeah, happy to be part of it.
Yeah, I definitely think that a lot of the busy work that either was kind of mundane tasks that we didn't like doing, or we hired more junior contributors to handle, or we outsourced, offshored. A lot of that stuff is now being handled by AI. Though it's interesting, it does seem like in the my bubble of RevOps people, the uptake of AI doesn't seem as like enthusiastic as maybe some of the other corners of the internet that I tend to be in, especially like the marketing world, for example, a very, very aggressive. And I wonder if that's a function of being cautious, if it's a function of not wanting to give away the playbook, and they're actually are doing a lot of AI behind the scenes, or, what do you think is happening?
Yeah, I think it's mostly like as we delved into this like agentic AI explosion, right? Now people are trying to figure out, and this is where it's like you put the horse before the cart. Like everyone's like, yes, we want to use AI, but now people are figuring out how do we actually use AI? How is it actually effective? Like in my circles, I'm yet to see some winning examples of like AI agents, you know, taking over the work that it promises. Like the promise is there. That's why I say like it reminds me of the early days of SaaS. Is like yes, it's more like, you know, things were there, but nobody was adopting it that well. It wasn't like as prevalent in the society as it is now. And I feel like AI is still in those days, but of course, it's like much faster pace. Like maybe next year, we will be talking about those AI agents actually doing something. So yeah, I think the pace is very fast, but I totally agree with you that there's a lot of like noise around it. And as RevOps, like we like to cut the noise and get to the point. So far, I haven't really seen a lot of like great examples of that. So yeah, totally agree with that, with your findings on that.
Yeah, I think I had like a leading indicator that when this was kind of triggered, that would tell me that AI has begun seeping into parts of the workforce beyond like the just the early adopters. And that was when my wife started talking about using it for work. And just the other day she was asking me about it. So I'm like, okay, now it seems like if it's getting to her kind of non-tech world, then it's whatever edge I've developed from kind of using these tools is starting to erode. But putting aside the AI thing for a while, you talked about these waves where we were in this really big kind of bullish run across the entire economy, and then there was like the kind of unnatural explosion of cheap capital during COVID, which really fed that. But then when that tap closed, there was a big kind of backlash, and a lot of people kind of were left not sure what to do, and there was a lot of layoffs. And you throw the AI efficiencies in there and all these things. So, do you think that during the earlier wave, the goal, the purpose of, or the way RevOps was kind of utilized was like, you are the way we feed the fire of growth at all costs, and now it's much more, you are how we find greater efficiencies, greater visibility, so that we can scale, uh, in an efficient way.
Yeah, so I think you touch upon a pretty interesting topic because I talk to like companies in, you know, just backed by VCs and then backed by PE, and I've seen this phase happening as well. So there is definitely, part of the play is, yes, eventually companies are, saying like growth at all cost is not the play anymore. We know that, right? But that doesn't mean that growth has stopped, right? So in the VC world, this is what if I compare the VC and PE backed experiences, and as I'm talking to, CEOs on both sides, uh, the PE backed is still like, that's the focus is profitability, right? The focus is more towards like, okay, how can we, make sure our EBITDA is good? Let's focus on CAC. Let's focus on M&As. Like, so RevOps has to kind of like make sure systems are ready for that. And on the VC side, still growth is what the VCs are always looking for, right? Because they want their multiple return. So they're still like kind of pushing that. So RevOps has to be still a lot more strategic there, and saying like, how do you get market penetration still in that? How do you increase ARR? If there's a PLG motion, like how do you set that up and bring the data analytics back there? So I think in both sides, RevOps is becoming more and more strategic, but I see like different priorities on both sides. So yeah, it's definitely versus what it used to be. It's much different, but I think there's remnants of the same kind of like, core goal for RevOps.
Yeah. And I think that's also a reflection of kind of the different philosophies between a PE backed company or PE in general and venture capital. And that's a whole other episode, I think. But, um, you know, if you kind of looking at the trend line, I think anyone who's in the world of tech or adjacent to it and other industries as well, with obviously the hiring trends have shifted, right? So it used to be I would get constant recruiters messaging me all the time, throwing, that stopped a long time ago, and I haven't heard from any of them, and I can just tell that it's a very tough out there across the board. Obviously, a role like RevOps with a lot of experience is a very desirable role. I would imagine that today, that in a RevOps role or in any role, but we're talking about RevOps, the resources that you have are probably more limited, right? There's kind of across the board, do more with less. Is that part of the trend? Is there still, is there that, going with a fine tooth comb, with hiring, with budgets for technology, like, is that trend happening there as well?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I think before we get to that, even I feel like revenue operations is still in the, I would say, in the phase where, as I'm talking to these leaders, they don't really understand what they're hiring for, and that's something like that is like going back to what the core problem is and why all of this is happening is like, you'll see, and it's amazing to see all these roles still pop up for revenue operations companies, like, that I really really admire, as like in SaaS space are hiring for revenue operations. You name like, OpenAI is investing, Databricks is investing, Canva is doing, Square is. Everyone's like actually realizing that like this, but how many of those are actually doing it right? You talk to people, still revenue operations reporting under sales. Okay, you got the basics wrong, right? And then if you talk to the people that are actually working in those roles, they'll tell you like, oh, it's still like the same kind of asks are coming in. We need this report for the board meeting. We need to do this. Like, people are not really, like, you ask how many of those sit in a board meeting, probably answer would be pretty low, almost none. How many of those actually carry a budget? Like, do you get RevOps decision making as a leader to actually, you're leading all the tech. Do you actually get the budget? No, like somebody else has the budget. You're talking to sales. I get that they're the end, users, but again, are you in those decision making, table, sitting there and making the call as a revenue operations leader, connecting all those dots? The answer is no, right? So I feel like going back to like when, and I advise this to a lot of like CEOs and for PE and VCs, is like, if you're hiring, you should know what you're hiring for, right? And that's your core like, and define the objectives for them very clearly. What you're hiring. I've been hired in places where people are like, now magically things are gonna get solved that are all on the JD, right? Okay, like that's that's not how things work, right? So be very clear and objective why you're hiring for this position. Then go understand your maturity cycle and then ask for things. Like if you're at an early stage, RevOps is gonna change things up. RevOps is gonna put some foundations in. So give them the space for that. Like, right, people who lose patience, like, why is RevOps not producing those results? If you're later stage, there are incremental improvements happening. So you have to be like patient with that because there are incremental improvements. There's no overnight change. So again, as founders and as leaders of the executive team and board, when people are hiring, they have to know what they're doing. And because it's relatively new, a little more ambiguity is out there. So yeah, I've been trying to at least just like bring a little bit of sanity there. Is like, don't set your RevOps up for failure. And that brings back to like, okay, the market is getting tougher, and things are things are not working in the ideal manner. It's brutal out there, to be honest, right? Um, so yeah, I think the core needs to fix before we get to the periphery.
So I'm actually surprised because we've been in this cycle where RevOps had its moment. Like it feels like every year, like this is the year of RevOps, right? It's just, maybe that's just biased because I'm kind of in the middle of it. But I think it was even 2 years ago that the number one job on LinkedIn or something was, and I think it's happened more than once. So to see that some of the larger, more respected companies are not kind of appreciating or treating it in a strategic way and just seeing it as maybe an admin of a CRM or something, that means there's more work to be done. But it was interesting you were talking about the reporting structure, because I believe that was one of the things that we talked about at this event that you and I went to, and there was some disagreement. So maybe we could double click on that. And in your world, from your perspective, when you're talking to people, working with clients, whatever it is, what is the correct ideal reporting structure for RevOps role?
Yeah, absolutely. And for the people who were not in that room, Mark and me know, like, there was no agreement. Everybody has opinions, right? And that's always the case, right? So again, when I hear that, like, oh, it should be under CRO, it should be under, even we had like CMO, we have all sorts of answers at the table, is like where it should fit. I personally have also reported under finance. I have reported under chief customer officer, and I've reported under someone called the president of go to market, right? So I think going back to, I always take a step back and go to what concept we're trying to solve is, you need a leader that actually believes in revenue operations and it's what it can actually drive. Like if you have a CRO who has a background where he does not really appreciate, or she does not really appreciate, what RevOps can actually bring to the table, in those cases, it is harmful for you to actually sit there. The core that you want to try to solve, which is what a lot of companies are getting wrong, is when you're reporting into sales, when you're reporting into one of the departments that you are actually helping, it's conflict of interest 101, right? You are creating that, and it's not like someone is gonna try to do that. It's just subconscious. Like I am gonna report the numbers on people that I report into. So I have a natural incentive to kind of like make sure, like, oh, well, this is bad, but like, do I really want to show this to the entire company with enthusiasm? Again, going back to, you don't want to create that system. You don't want to create that environment. You want to create unbiased. So to be unbiased, I always think revenue operations as a separate branch. So you have sales, you have marketing, you have CX, and you have revenue operations. It sits separately. It's like similar to one of them. It can report into CRO, all independent, or it can actually report into finance. Or I really liked working under someone called a go-to-market president, who had basically similar role, kind of like led all of these. Uh, but in my experience, that person had an ops background. So they were like, yes, you as RevOps are my secret sauce. So to make sure all of these other departments are aligned, achieving what we want to achieve as a company. So, as your strategic partner. And that's, I think, like the best rhythm for RevOps to be.
Yeah, but as you know, it's
Not the reality.
yeah, not the reality. I mean, I think my answer at that time was to the CRO, but the caveat is that I think CRO is also poorly defined and has been often used as just a VP of sales with a C at the beginning of it. And like you said, if the role of RevOps is to be, unbiased in its reporting, and you have a CRO who is really just a head of sales, your incentive, there's bias is kind of inherent there. And so it creates all sorts of complexities that I'm very glad I don't have to make decisions on in my day to day.
100%. And like you said, like if you have a CRO that has a sales background, naturally this person would lean towards sales, right? And marketing and CX in the whole funnel are equally important, right? They bring something to, again, like we're getting to the world where it's not even like I would say a funnel anymore, right? It's like it's more circular. Everything is happening all the time. We're moving towards like intent based. We're moving towards like getting more and more data points from all of these touch points together. So people have to realize that these three departments are gonna make sure that you supercharge all of this. So I think one of the other areas that we had the conversation following there is like, then what's the step for RevOps professionals to go into leadership, right? Which was like, what's your next natural progression? And I think, yeah, I mean, again, very, very interesting answers we got there. But in that case, let's say if you have a CRO that comes from revenue operations, they know how to give equal love to all of them, right? So they know how, because they've been trained that way. They have been, working their way to make sure all of these departments work together. And that makes it a, very good candidate to say like, okay, yes, a RevOps professional can lead some of these departments to make sure it all works. And they're putting the data hat, they're putting the decision-making efficiency in mind. So yeah, I thought that was a very interesting conversation as well.
Yeah, definitely. And I still don't know quite the answer in terms of the upward mobility question, because as ideal as it would be, I think the CRO, at least in kind of reality and the way I see it, is often really looked at as somebody who comes from sales, at least today.
And the
And
targets, they just give them the same target, so it naturally makes them aligned to that.
all right, well, I don't know if we're going to be able to solve that one, but moving on to the state of, well, first, maybe we can talk a little bit about, the folks who are in the trenches in those RevOps roles today, how they could maybe navigate some of these challenges. It's sometimes hard to even know which way the wind is blowing, and one day it seems like it's this way, one day it seems like that way. But, since you have a pretty good view from the top, you're meeting with a lot of companies, different companies, and you've been in the space for a long time. What's some advice that you can give to RevOps professionals kind of out there today on how to build their own moat, how to create as much value as they can within their role, and maybe set themselves up for continued growth in their career?
Yeah, absolutely. On the flip side, it's not a doom and gloom. So for revenue operations professionals, I feel like again, um, I've been through the cycle of like when sales operations was just like, hey, here's the back office admin ticket solvers, like, Salesforce admin. And now I've seen that focus. So I feel like, especially revenue operations professional today, they have an edge for what we used to have like in the past. So people are at least listening to you. Of course, there's still like you have to be the champion within your organization. Again, going back to how you do that, if you're and this is how I had applied in various different companies as I was doing, like when you make those incremental improvements or major changes to that, make sure you approach it in a way that like you are able to show the value to the leadership. Again, numbers, they cannot be argued against, so that's the best way to do that. Always have a baseline first and then show people like how you're incrementally improving all of these things, right? And then make sure all your stakeholders know that. I used to do a newsletter on a monthly basis.
Internally.
internally. Like you have to champion yourself. You have to champion what things are happening. Otherwise, if I tell people like, hey, there's a workflow that I just created that changed your entire process, I have to train that specific team again and again, but nobody else actually knows about it. And we just talked about how all of these things are becoming so interconnected, right? So if you do something for sales, marketing and CX should also know, because they are going to get affected at some point. So yeah, internally doing that again, championing for what you're doing and showing people the value of it, and then constantly taking feedback, because these are your end customers and users. You want to make sure things are working for them or not. So one is that, and the other one is like be more strategic, be more proactive. And again, easier said than done, I get that, but there are ways where intentionally you can sit at every quarter and think about the largest problems that you can solve that are actually going to impact the ARR the most. Leadership is going to listen, everyone's going to listen, because you are aligning with the company goals, but you're doing it strategically. And then you present that as your roadmap, and people listen. Now you're being way more, proactive than saying like, oh, well, something broke, let's fix this and then talk about it next quarter. Um, yeah. And I think that all helps.
Yeah, and I think the sooner you can do that, the better. If you're new in a role, because you want to establish precedent about where the way you see the role, or else, yeah.
Yeah, and for folks, like I would say, just for the folks, like if you needed like a framework, I've published this like a 30, 60, 90-day plan for RevOps leaders that can be a just helpful checklist for people.
All right, we'll include that in the show notes if we can, so the folks at home can get a look at that. Um, so we talked about the state of RevOps. We talked about hiring. We talked about kind of the role itself and the different views of its function. The one piece that we have yet to talk about is kind of the technology area space, right? So I think, from my perspective, the way sales tech, revenue tech has been treated, it follows the same kind of trends, right? So we were in a time of zero interest rates, easy money, growth at all costs. Everybody got whatever little point solution they wanted. Didn't matter. You go whatever you want. And there was a lot of different solutions that needed to be connected together. Maybe they were, maybe they weren't. And it got a little crazy, right? So I think we've kind of seen a kind of either reversion to the mean or an overcorrection, where we're getting a lot of consolidation. A lot of people are focusing on platforms. If you can get the kind of core platform to get 75% of the way there that your point solution did, figure it out. Do you see do you see that do you see that happening? And B, do you see the role of RevOps in kind of building? We have that build versus buy question. Is the build part of that question more of a default these days because of that shift?
Yeah, no, that's a great question, and I think uh, starting from the trend, absolutely. I think we have seen a time where, on average, I saw like 20 plus tools when people were like, "Yeah, we have a lot of money, go figure it out, growth at all costs, like that's fine." Um, when the market changed, people were like, "Do we really need this tool?" Right? And then the conversation started shifting towards that, and part of it is, of course, like budget cuts and all of these other things. Um, but I think this is like something that revenue operations should have already adopted, right? Because efficiency is what we are driving towards. So yeah, if you have, um, I've seen tools with like almost no adoption that were just sitting there because sales had really liked this tool from last company, and now you have it but nobody used it. Like, again, are you solving the problem, or you just started with the tool first, right? So I think as that is happening, I call it the great convergence now of like all these tools, right? uh, with the use of AI now, low code, development, it's becoming more, the line is becoming more and more blurry, right? Like who does what. Everyone's like, companies like Gong will tell you we do all of the other things that all of your tools do, and you go to Outreach, SalesLoft, and they'll say we do all of the things Gong do. Now you're like, as a buyer, you're starting to get a little confused. It's like, okay, which direction do I go? If you're a finance person, like the head of finance, you really don't care which tool you use. You're like, just pick one and make sure costs are going down. I would say, like, I initially started with uh, a little bit of rigidness in that, because again, I come from like where we had specialized tools for each and everything. So again, I do at some points it matters, right? The example I give you is like, um, let's take, if you take like McDonald's, and McDonald's says like, hey, we started our own pizza. Like, if I really want a burger, do I really go to McDonald's also getting pizza, right? It's like, or do I go somewhere else, right? So now, yes, you have it does not really mean that you do it well. But going back to, again, taking a step back from everything, this is a situation. Let's go back to the core. What are you trying to solve, right? Do you rate, what is your actual problem, and is there a need? Because no one's going to use it if there's no need, and you found this new shiny thing. Again, all that glitter is not gold. So now you have to try to figure out like what your actual core problem is, and then you go buy. And then SaaS companies have to realize that like buyers are much more educated now, right? It's it's at my fingertips to have a whole analysis of all these tools comparison that I put in ChatGPT, and I have that, right? Again, you didn't. So now the SaaS companies also have to realize that, like, if that is happening, how are you going to show your value? So I feel like when it gets all blurry, everybody can do the same thing. AI is not your like standout factor anymore. AI is like a baseline. If you don't have AI, I'm questioning why you don't have it. So now it comes down to, if you strip all of that, like the areas that are you should focus on is like, is this tool solving the right problem? Do you have the buy-in from all the end users that are actually going to use it? And then go down to, is this direction that you're going to 3 years down the line, are you going to ask the question like, hey, should we find a different tool, right? Especially if you're working in a Series A to C range company, you have limited resources. So what you want to do is you want to find a partner, right? You don't want to just like a vendor that is there. You want somebody that can take work off my hands. Like, I would absolutely take that any day. So you, again, now that aspect of all of that becomes way more important. Like, right, it becomes like, who is a good partner for me? Tools are starting to do exactly the same thing. And where, if I'm trying to solve this problem and down the line, is this my long-term solution? Or, because we all know that like change management down the line is a lot more costly, right? So you don't want to do that. So be strategic in that approach, trying to find that. And a great example on, like, I recently got a personal finance app, right? My buyer journey was a very different one, because I am an educated buyer. I go out, I research, I shortlist to, I started making, pros and cons lists between the two. One was a shiny, tool that did everything, Notion looking tool. Again, I started trialing both of them, right? As like free trials. Okay, great. Now I had the core problem first, what I'm trying to solve. Hey, I need like a good dashboard. I need workflows that work well. I need something like a intelligent transaction tracking. Like, if I have something coming in, it can just categorize itself. Both said, yes, we do it, right? Again, in the trial phase, I had exactly what I was looking for. I started doing that, and the shiny tool started glitching, because there's like AI is putting it into the wrong buckets. Now I'm trying to solve that, and I'm like, okay, this is, even though I had all of that, they did check all the boxes. Now that I started using, okay, not great. And then I looked at the integrations, because I wanted to integrate it with my bank. I want to integrate it with my 401k. Like, again, I started the integrations, and I started realizing, okay, yeah, it's not as great as it looked. So I started with what I needed, did it check all of that, right? And then I go back into like, okay, now I'm starting to use it. My user experience is there. It matters. Then I reached out to the customer service to see like, hey, if things are working. 2 days go by, I didn't get a reply. The other one, totally different experience, even though it lacked one or two other features that this tool had. But customer service was spot on. User interface was easy. AI was working great. I built out workflows and stuff for future transactions. So again, like the same way, if I'm approaching like going out buying RevTech, and I have a partner that kind of, again, everyone's gonna do the similar kind of thing. So you have to distinguish yourself.
Yeah. There's one kind of. I think this will kind of do this part, and then we'll sort of bring things to a close. But one of the fascinating things to me is that, especially lately, there's been kind of a proliferation of AI tools that have completely democratized the kind of building of essentially full stack applications, right? You can, with prompting with Cursor or VO or Bolt or Lovable, or I have all of them open right now here. You can essentially, with really very almost no coding, but at least maybe kind of understanding of systems, build. And so it used to be that either the question was buy or build meant something very, very big, or you use something like Zapier or Tooljet or whatever, or Retool. But now, there's this idea I could basically talk to Cursor and kind of build these small applications. But I've yet to see that really take off from the RevOps side of the house. And I'm surprised. I don't know if maybe I'm just not seeing it yet, but it seems like an obvious kind of thing to pick up on.
Yeah, I think like with the buy versus build debate, it I feel like it depends on like where you are at as an organization, right? So I have absolutely built in-house solutions. I've built out commission app in Salesforce. Again, that wasn't that much cost. Like integrated systems within Salesforce, create a custom object that bring in data every day, and you parse it out and kind of. So you can absolutely build it. Now, how much was, again? Why did we do it? We were a startup. We didn't have money to dash out for another tool immediately. Kind of worked our way. Again, there are definitely tools out there that specialize in doing that, right? So yeah, build is not always the right choice. There are tools that are doing commission stuff that are now AI based that can build you a model like much quicker. Perfect. Like, again, that wasn't just the application, that our business model was different. But again, to your point, yes, the build part, it's not as strong there because again, buy is becoming much easier. Things are becoming more and more like, hey, there's a free tool that you can start working with, and tools that are more modular, like Clay, and somebody's like, hey, you can build whatever you want, kind of thing. Again, that's I think definitely making the part where like again, you are still buying, okay, but then you're also building on top of it. That serves you more long term because it's just much more flexible. But yeah, I think I have seen very similar trends on my end as well.
Yeah. Well, I think we'll leave it at that for today. Hassan, thank you so much for joining us. Before we go, if there's anywhere you want the folks at home can maybe learn more about you and kind of the stuff you're doing, now is a good time to pick
Yeah,
to throw it.
absolutely. You can find me on LinkedIn under Hassan Ishad, and for the RevOps community, I'm always there. Like I'm open to connecting, talking through things again, give back to the community.
All right. Well, I really appreciate your time today, and thank you so much.